Professor Wesley, thanks for your time as always. If we needed to get any sort of reminder of how tough this is in various parts of the world, we got it with those reports there. Let's start in the UK, where it's extraordinary. The Prime Minister remains in critical care.
Absolutely, and you can tell the sense of kind of national confusion that's going on in the UK. Boris Johnson had emerged as a very strong leader. We saw that emphatic election victory late last year. He had played a very prominent role. He's a very good public performer in leading the British response, in exemplifying the British response. For him to get sick and then to be taken into hospital and then taken into intensive care, I think, is a really big psychological blow for a country that is facing a really rough set of weeks and months ahead, and just hoping against hope that it won't follow Italy and Spain into those terrible scenes that we've seen in those countries.
Yeah, they'd be hoping. And you saw with Dominic Raab that lectern that he was using with the message in terms of protecting the NHS, stay at home. They're using every opportunity possible to try and keep a lid on it.
Look, that's right. And all governments are really treading a very fine line here between projecting confidence and leadership and, you know, a willingness to be optimistic about the future. And I think our government is doing that as well, but also projecting the right sort of caution that these are not normal times, that we have to make sure that we're taking this very seriously and keeping to ourselves and effectively shutting down economies when they need to be shut down.
From the UK, let's look to the United States, and I want to play for our viewers some comments the President made in relation to the World Health Organization and funding for the WHO.
We're going to put a hold on money spent to the WHO. We're going to put a very powerful hold on it, and we're going to see. It's a great thing if it works, but when they call every shot wrong, that's no good.
Is it time to freeze funding to the WHO during a pandemic?
No, maybe not. I mean, I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but we're going to look at it.
You did say that.
We give a tremendous... No, I didn't. I said we're going to look at it. We're going to investigate it. We're going to look at it. But we will look at ending funding.
Professor Wesley, you look at that reaction. It's a president who... not just himself, his administration, the whole country is under immense pressure in the face of that crisis.
Yeah, look, the United States is going through terrible trauma at the moment. And the natural response is to look for scapegoats for what has happened. We've already seen Trump blame China for the virus and blame all of the destruction that's occurring on China. The next easiest scapegoat, I suppose, is the WHO. We've seen conservative commentators in the United States accuse the WHO of being intimidated by Xi Jinping in China, of not sending out clear messages about the seriousness of the crisis because allegedly China was leaning on the WHO. And then, of course, you've got a long-standing suspicion on the right of American politics with any international organisation, and the WHO looks like a big international bureaucracy. And I think the reporter asked a really good question then, is this the right time to be withdrawing funding for an organisation that is leading in a global fight against a global pandemic?
The other thing that when we touch on, when you look at the WHO, and you alluded to it to an extent, that the China role in all of this, how does this play out in the medium to longer term? Obviously, when you're talking about the reaction from other leaders, G20 leaders and so on, we're talking sort of further down the track. First of all, you've got to get through the crisis. But when we get to that point, what can we expect in terms of the pressure on Beijing, China, its management of this crisis, the fact that it covered up information early on and allowed this thing to spread?
Yeah, look, that is a line of attack, an argument that is very prominent at the moment, not only in the United States. You can see it in European media, you can see it in media here in Australia. And China is certainly not taking this sort of criticism lying down. It is putting out a very strong line that, in fact, China is allegedly leading the global fight against the pandemic, that it is sharing its expertise with the rest of the world, that it is sharing medical equipment, ventilators. We've seen it's sending ventilators to the United States and elsewhere, and China is trying to control that particular narrative and turn it on its head to turn this into a kind of a soft power victory. This will continue to be a real competition, if you like, over soft power between those who want to use this to perhaps dent China's image globally versus China, which is trying to use this crisis to, in effect, bolster its image, particularly in countries in this particular region, but also places like the Middle East and Africa.
Finally, I want to get your thoughts on the Prime Minister's language in terms of economic sovereignty. He used it today when he spoke about the massive package, $130 billion JobKeeper package. This notion of economic sovereignty, it's been emerging in recent days, hasn't it, in terms of the need to have more independence, really, from what has become such a globalised world?
Look, I think that is an inevitable and somewhat emotional reaction to this crisis. The initial response to this crisis is that we've become dangerously interdependent on the rest of the world. But the fact is, if you take a more medium and long-term view of things, we are always, and we have always been, dependent on the rest of the world. An Australia that is autarkic, that has no links with the rest of the world, is a very much impoverished Australia. We get a great deal of enrichment from our links with the rest of the world. I think that instead of talking in the language of sovereignty, we should be talking about how we get beyond this crisis, how we rebuild important and enriching international links, but we build resilience and we build the ability to protect ourselves against outbreaks like this into the system. I think that's a much better way of talking about responses to the crisis than throwing up sovereignty and autarky arguments.
Professor Wesley, as always, appreciate your time. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Melbourne. Thanks.